who would say that you feel free in life, that you have that you have a lot of freedom in your life? Okay. You already know that, of course, it's going to be a trick question. You know that. You knew when I was asking that. You knew. Because you have been actually taken hostage. And you may feel free, but your freedom may actually be an illusion. So, of course, you've not been taken literally hostage. I'm not keeping you here. You can still move around if you want, but your mind has been taken hostage. So it's mainly when you start to wonder, what's really important for yourself in life. So I think for a lot of us, we have been studying hard. So education, our professional success may have been really important. Our career. Also possibly doing our shopping. This is a picture from a Black Friday. Possibly also being able to buy our own house. That may be a dream for a lot of people. Also looking after our own health. That may be an important topic. And a lot of us also are addicted to a lot of the social media. And a lot of us, we actually a part of a rat race. It often feels like that in a daily life. And trying to live life to the max. And also sometimes when we think about meaning, actually as if meaning is something that we can buy, we can just pick it from the shelves in the store, and as if we can buy some instant meaning. That we think, well, I do this and then I'll be happy. That these are things that we often do or can do in our daily life. So possibly you may recognize some bits and pieces of what I've just said in a couple of seconds. You may recognize a little bit or much of those examples. But those examples, they are more or less associated with actually that your mind has been taken hostage by capitalism, by our economic system, and that actually your mind may actually be fundamentally saying on a very fundamental level, I love capitalism. I love capitalism. I love capitalism. And of course, it's not literally when you go to the store that you literally get the word capitalism branded on it. No, it doesn't work that way, obviously, but it may be there, actually. So this is what I call the capitalist life syndrome. And the capitalist life syndrome, to really summarize it very briefly, that's like having been taken hostage and where actually our meaning has been replaced with the meaning of the wider economic system of others. And even in a case when our captors are actually not good for our mental and even possibly physical health. So when I use the term the capitalist life syndrome, it's a term that I've named this after the Stockholm Syndrome. So the Stockholm Syndrome is a pseudo-diagnosis of a group of people, and they were taken hostage in a bank in Stockholm, and actually they were in a bad situation. However, they started to identify themselves as people who have really taken them hostage. So instead of what you would expect is they were totally against their hostage takers, they actually then start to identify themselves with them, and the police had difficulties having them witness against those hostage takers. So that's Stockholm Syndrome. And in a similar way, when I look at a lot of the research, what I'm going to speak about in this presentation is a lot of research is actually telling how a lot of us identify implicitly and explicitly with a lot of the values from our economic system. And actually in a similar way almost as we have been taken hostage. So in this presentation, this has 3 parts. Part 1, I'll speak about my hypothesis. Part 2, I'll speak about the research projects that are confirming those hypotheses, and then I have some applications of this in real life. And by the way, I will put the slides up online. A previous version is already there. So my hypothesis is that there's no individual, because there's only the economy, you stupid. to summarize it with a famous quote. I will say a little bit more about capitalist life syndrome, what it is, and then actually saying, well, that's not the only answer to our current situation. Because the other answer is what has often been called the meaning-oriented economy, and I'll say a little bit more about transition. So, where do I come from? Why did I start to look at the capitalist life syndrome? Why did I start to really look at our society? So, possibly some of you may know the book that I've written, in which I summarized, like, what do we know about meaning, particularly about the individual psychology of meaning. And then I actually started to look at, well, a lot of my clients. I see that the struggles they have in finding meaning in life is actually a struggle with the crisis of our society that we're in. Like, what I told at the start of the day, and what also Martin has also spoken about in a very eloquent way. Like, yes, we need to find meaning, live a meaningful life in this complex world of crisis. So I had to look at that. And this is the book that actually we're going to have the official book launch during the lunch break. And so I had to look at social psychology to understand that intersection. And actually, this is a title I already had there, even before I knew that Martin was going to actually speak about that as well. The personal is political. It is. And that's also what we're doing here, is looking at the intersection between the personal and the social meaning. So, what I use as the term Stockholm Syndrome, or actually the capitalist life syndrome, it is actually like a term that's speaking about how do the economic values, how do they translate on an individual level? That's what I'm speaking about. What is it that we do in our individual lives, how the economic system is reflected there? So this is, in summary, what the characteristics of the capitalist life syndrome. And I'll go through those different aspects very quickly. So the first thing is, of course, when I use the term capitalism, a lot of people will immediately say, what capitalism? Because it is such a broad term and there's so many different aspects. So there's not one thing that is called capitalism, or that some of the left groups have been like kind of creating like that there's one big monster and all of that is called capitalism. Now there are many varieties in that, and I think that that's an important thing to bear in mind as well. So when I use that term, it has very much to do with the philosophy about the importance of private property, an economy that is focused on self-interest and competition, about capital accumulation, wage labor, prices set by the market, the idea that we are free to choose, and actually like that the market is coordinated by businesses instead of by governments. So that's like the economic system that I will be focusing on. And what I see, and that's actually very much what I will what I will also say about the research studies, is people living in such capitalist countries are more likely to focus on these types of meanings. Because people in a capitalist country, they focus more on materialistic, hedonistic, or self-oriented types of meanings. Whereas when you go to countries which are relatively less capitalistic, people seem to focus significantly more on social or larger types of meanings, or more existential, philosophical types of meanings. I'll go into those details a bit more later. And also there's the aspect which is comparable with the Stockholm Syndrome, is where actually there is a sense of being trapped, or kind of a sense of fatalism, nihilism, hopelessness, that a lot of people actually have in capitalist countries, more than in countries which are actually less capitalistic. So that's a paradox. On the one hand, people identify themselves with the hijackers, who objectively threaten them, but at the same time, people defend them, but they feel unfree. And so these are the paradoxes where, and that's what I see a lot in the literature and also in my own research, those paradoxes. Having the illusion of being free, but at the same time feeling, well, I have actually no alternative. And also what I could see in the literature and also in the research is how actually like people living or people actually suffering from this capitalist life syndrome have a lot of existential questions and moods, like struggling with choice overload, difficulty decision making, uncertainty, anxiety, anger. And there's also, not only on an existential level, but also on an emotional level, where possibly on the short term, going on a big holiday, buying a new television, on the short term, of course, that can make you happy. But to really give the deep life satisfaction, the long-term sense of meaningfulness, is actually more absent. So these are some of those characteristics of what I call the capitalist life syndrome, where I'm saying, all those things quite often go hand in hand. They're strongly related. And when we think about how do people find meaning, what's the meaning that people experience in capitalistic countries, are those things often kind of combined. And there's one more thing that I forgot to mention, and that's the dominant approach to meaning. Because when I spoke about those types of meaning, that's very much about the question about what type of meaning do people have. But when I speak about an approach to meaning, that's about how do we approach meaning. So that's the difference, you hear that, between what is meaning, that's the content, and it's about how do we relate to meaning. That's a difference that I get from Heidegger. And so what you see is in other countries, people have a more traditional approach to meaning. For instance, where they would be more conformistic, take over ideas, for instance, from religion. Or actually what we see is also other groups or a more modern development where people are more critical intuitive, where people listen to the intuition, to themselves, in a very critical manner. But it's more like going inside to understand what's meaningful. However, what we see in capitalist countries is more like the functionalistic approach. Oh, actually, I'm saying that here on those slides. I'm already ahead of myself. It's like a skill that I've also developed to test this, but I'm already babbling on here. So, so this is a traditional attitude, what I was saying. And this is, again, that functionalistic attitude that we see a lot in capitalist countries where we kind of seem to be having the idea, well, we can buy meaning in the store, almost that sense, If you buy an expensive holiday, your life will be meaningful. So the belief that you can pick any random meaning, and if this one doesn't work, well, you pick another one. And it almost becomes like living from kick to kick. And the idea that we can create our own meaning in life, instead of really listening intuitively and perceiving what's really going on inside ourselves. So this is what I mentioned about capitalist life syndrome. These things are often going hand in hand. But then, interestingly enough, that's not the only answer. Where what I will be showing in the next bit of the presentation is actually how we go much more towards a meaning-oriented economy, or towards an economic meaning orientation. So, which is very much actually people who are not looking at the capitalist values, and where people have a much broader range of types of meanings, and not only the materialistic stuff, but also looking at the social aspects, like a morality, looking at also nature, ecology, etc. And also people have this phenomenological, this kind of intuitive approach, where people listen more to themselves with self-insight to find out, well, what's meaningful. And where people feel that they're free to change their life situation, but at the same time, they know the limitations. So it's being responsible and free at the same time. So what you see is like, there is a shift towards a meaning-oriented economy. So this is what I'm actually, one of my main hypotheses, and this is very much what I will show has been changing. And we are precisely, I dare to say, at this point, where we are changing from a lot of people suffering from the capitalist life syndrome, where we are actually transforming, more and more people are having like this orientation towards a meaning orientation in the economy. So, does this sound like you? Or does this sound like you? Just listen to yourself what your answer will be. So, what do we know, what does the research actually tell about this? Because these are big statements, and I can imagine that you're saying, well, yeah, well, nice things that you're saying, that nice theory, but hey, stop and give me some evidence. Yeah, okay. I will try to do that now. The first bit is, of course, I had to look into the literature on economics. And anyone who has ever read any handbook on economics will know that even on the first pages, more or less it's telling economics is a neutral, objective science. And it's a descriptive human science which is describing how people interact. And just describing the supply and demand in the market in neutral terms. And you can even quantify that. And as a good example is what the Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker wrote in 1966. He was speaking about love. And I'm sure you can totally relate to this, because it's written in such very subjective terms that really appeal to the affections that people have. Because he was writing, it can be said that MI loves FJ if her welfare and thus his utility function, and perhaps also if MI values emotional and physical contact with FJ. This is love. This is how economists see love. I don't know about you, but this is not how I experience love. But yeah, it is like that illusion, as if economics can be neutral. And like the economist Hudson is saying, well, the mantra of neutrality, that's a total deception. This is junk economics. And then in the last decade, there have been many studies and many books, and the titles of those books, they are already very telling. So like economics as religion, the values of economics, economics of good and evil, the worldly philosophers, and it goes on and on. So when you read those books, that illusion of neutrality doesn't, it doesn't stand. Like economics is very much about certain values. So all economic systems describe a specific type of meaning and a specific approach to how these types of meanings can be realized. That's very much the conclusion when you read those books. But when we look then in the history and anthropology of meaning and in different places, in different economies, what do we know about that? So I did a systematic literature review on 1,560 publications on the relationship between meaning and capitalism. I'm not going through each of those papers now with you. That will be a little bit too much. But I'll show you a little bit of the overview, and I'm going to skip this very quickly. Because it's stable, I'm even not going through this one with you. But what I've done here is showing actually the different types of economies that a lot of economists are speaking about, like the early type of survival economies, going towards more hierarchical type of collectivist economies, like we also saw in the Middle Ages, and the more religious types of economies and more socialist ones. What we really see is those more early types of economies, and when you really start to read about what are the values that really underlying that. There's a bit of survival, but a lot of that is very social, and it's about connecting with the community, connecting with society, and not always in a very functionalistic way, but in a much more connected way and intuitive. And anyone who has ever been in non-Western countries, let's call it in that way, you may have experienced that, particularly when you go to the market, and where the connection with people is totally different than when you go to a supermarket here. That is such a huge difference, where you feel it's not only about the transaction, it's a human interaction. Whereas, for instance, for a lot of the indigenous people, people like here, when I went a couple of years ago, this is in Borneo, and I was there going in one of those longhouses where I was staying. It's in the middle of the rainforest. Those people, in any economic transaction, it's being seen as part of society. It's seen as inherently social, it's seen as inherently even spiritual. You cannot separate those issues. However, when we start to look at more modern types of philosophies and the modern economies which have started from 1600s onwards, we know about liberalism, where it started with still Adam Smith, who was still very moral. That's not a debate I can have, but he was not the selfish bastard that a lot of the authors paint him as. There was a lot of morality in it. Well, then it became more the rational idea that the illusion of neutrality. And then we still had the early Austrian school, beginning of the 20th century, where there were a lot of individual values and was still quite psychological. Well, then we got people like Hayek, Friedman, Marshall, and for them, like particularly in the 50s, 60s, it became a very strong focus on materialistic, hedonistic, self-oriented types of meanings, very highly functionalistic. So what you see, interestingly enough, is that this current idea of capitalism and neoliberalism is a very, very modern idea. It's a very modern lifestyle, and which has not been on Earth for such a long time. So what we really see is that, yeah, actually, like, you cannot say that economy is neutral. It's inherently related to meaning. So I already mentioned that I've done this big literature review and looking at the relationship between meaning and capitalism. And yeah, so these are some of the findings. So in the first place, I found these are more the philosophical types of publications that I found in my literature review. And I think if I would have continued more rigorously with my literature review, I would have found many more publications. But there are actually quite a lot of publications, books, articles, very fundamental from an existential, Marxist, or critical perspective on how capitalism or economy in general, how that is related to meaning. And then actually I also found really many studies on the relationship between macroeconomic phenomena, meaning, and capitalism. So the literature is, for instance, telling how particularly social sources of meaning are really important in the economic context, where actually like an interaction in the market is more than just a financial transaction. And particularly when in the workplace, like your connections with your colleagues is crucial for your well-being, but also the well-being of the company. And also what we know from a lot of research is that income, it may improve happiness, but not necessarily meaning, not necessarily the big life satisfaction. Actually, there are quite a lot of studies which indicate that poorer countries have a larger life satisfaction. So when you look in the literature, all those studies, they seem very contradictory, but when you start to sum them up, the conclusion seems to be clear, like, yes, on the short term, a lot of money can help, but on the long term, for real deep meaning in life, we need something else than merely income. I like what also Martin has already mentioned about the inequality, the socio-economic inequality is actually associated with lower happiness, lower life satisfaction. And there are particularly a lot of studies on how a bad housing situation, a bad neighborhood, how particularly these lead to a worse life satisfaction. Particularly people are often stuck like in a poverty trap. Whereas the opposite almost of it is where people live in a positive connection with nature that helps to improve your life satisfaction and your meaning. There are quite a lot of studies on that. And another interesting one is that meaning and this deeper satisfaction about life, it does not depend on economic freedom. That was actually what Martin, or what actually Friedman was saying. Friedman was saying, yes, the economic freedom, the freedom of the market is crucial for people to really live a good life. Total nonsense. There's no empirical evidence for that. So the idea that we need a free market to be able to live a good life, that is not validated by the literature. However, political freedom seems to be crucial to be able to live a meaningful life. So what else do we know? So we know, particularly there are many studies which have looked at nations in transition. And we know that from all the research, how, for instance, where after a financial crisis, after a political change, after revolution, post-communism, we see that an individual sense of meaning is shattered. Yeah, of course. That makes sense. But we also see that people who are able to find meaning, to experience meaning, in those periods of transition, they are able to get out of it in a more positive sense. And they're able to cope more effectively with the crisis. Then there are many studies on the role of meaning in vulnerable individuals in countries where they struggle to experience meaning in life. Like people with chronic or life-threatening physical disease, immigrants, people with an addiction, elderly people, ethnic minority groups, and how actually meaning is important to cope with society and to cope with the struggles and the tensions of being a vulnerable individual. So living a meaningful life is knowing that everything can be taken from me but my dreams about a better world. And then we come to the literature on what I call the capitalist life syndrome. And indeed, we can see that the literature is already saying with all those, these are the numbers of articles you see there, and these are again the same symptoms of the capitalist life syndrome, which I've mentioned before. And we see indeed there's a lot of literature that is confirming all those aspects, that indeed a lot of people living in capitalist countries, people with strong capitalist values, that they orient more towards a materialistic, consumerist types of meanings, towards hedonistic, experiential or self-oriented types of meanings. We also see that they have a more functionalistic approach to meaning. They are also more fatalistic. And also there are more existential questions. However, what I already mentioned, like the capitalist life syndrome is not the only answer to our current economic system. No, there are actually many books and many articles which are now telling we are moving towards a meaning-oriented economy. And that actually there are already 31 books on the meaning-oriented economy and meaning-oriented business. So all those books actually have been published in the last 10 years. So it's a very sudden trend. It's becoming more and more popular. So, and other more specific examples are authors who have been looking at moral economics, compassionate economics, ecologically sustainable. So these are looking at the social and the larger types of meanings from a non-functionalistic perspective. And actually at the World Economic Forum in 2016, the major leaders there said that this meaning-oriented economy will have its tipping point around 2020. From then onwards, economy will be totally different. Because they're saying the proportion of the economy that thrives on, for instance, products and services, like it currently does, it will shift much more towards actually consumption and production, which is much more around something what's really meaningful for people. And I'll give more examples of that later. And like Drew and Larson, they analyzed over 1 million social media data, and they found out that since 2012, the meaning-oriented share of the economy has more than doubled. And some others have said that it's particularly the millennials, and possibly even more Generation Z, so these are the youngest people, that they are becoming less materialistic and have much more minimalist lifestyle, where actually looking at a larger perspective at ecology, at nature, at really what matters in life, that's becoming more important. So what we see is we are moving towards another type of economy, and these are all these publications that I found on specific aspects of the economy where meaning matters and where research has been done on. And that's particularly since 2010, suddenly a big boost. And we see that meaning is relevant in almost all societal domains, in the workplace, in tourism, in volunteering, in media, in sports, in art. It's really coming up very quickly. So in sum, the literature is already saying that the individual meaning and economic system are strongly related. That big idea about the economy being neutral, that's nonsense. Because it's individuals who actually realize that in their daily lives. Very much about the connections, what actually Roy was also already speaking about, how, like the doxa, how actually the way how we speak, how that also informs us. And I've also already shown that particularly since 2010, there seems to be this meaning-oriented trend, where we move away from the capitalist life syndrome to a more meaning-oriented economy, and where that meaning helps in periods of transition. So my next question is, this is still the literature in general, but I would like to have some more data. I really like that. So what I did is I looked at all studies in which people have been asked what's meaningful in your life, what's purposeful, what's valuable, or what's important. Because I believe that when we use those terms, they more or less refer to the same. And there are many big frameworks that have been used by many different authors, but I feel instead of looking at one's own specific definition, let's have this overarching idea. So then I started to combine those. And then I found more than 107 studies, more than 45,000 people worldwide from 70 countries. And this is where I found those 5 different types of meanings. So I found those materialistic, hedonistic types of meanings, which I particularly found in capitalist countries. I'll say a bit more about it later. So these are things like focusing on your wealth, focusing on your finances, on your successful career, like just having fun, and focusing very much on sports, things like that. And also self-oriented types of meanings, which is very much about your self-efficacy, self-acceptance, autonomy, self-care. And what we see is that those meanings are significantly more seen in capitalist countries. Whereas the social types of meanings are seen more in countries which are relatively less capitalistic. And so examples are feeling socially connected, belonging to a community, following social expectations, altruism, giving birth. And also larger types of meanings. These are the big words that are often used by purpose, personal growth, the bigger perspective about temporality, justice. These topics, these types of meanings, have been seen as much more important in less capitalistic countries. And then there are also some more existential types of meanings, which are the more abstract things. For instance, when I work a lot with dying people, or people in palliative care, that say, well, I just find meaning in the fact that I'm breathing, the fact that I'm here. That's really meaningful in itself. So those more abstract type of meanings, they're covered under this. But there are not a difference between between capitalistic and less capitalistic countries. So what I did is I had all those studies, I've combined them. And then I looked at actually like, what do we know, like what are some economic characteristics of those countries in which those people live. So I took a lot of the different types of ways how we can operationalize capitalism. These are all those different ways how we can actually operationalize capitalism. Because I thought, because capitalism, it's such a variety of things. Let's also use many different variables. And these are all the correlations, which you absolutely will be able to read now, I'm sure. But hey, I'll go directly to the conclusions. Well, I've already shared that indeed the economic system correlates very much with individual types of meaning, where you see that the economic system has a large impact. The economic system has a larger impact on individual meaning than culture or political freedom or the socio-economic mobility. So what I'm saying there is like, because I thought, well, what's meaningful for people in their lives? I thought, well, it will also be culture. That explains a lot. But actually I found out it's more capitalism. It's the economic system which is predictive significantly. So it's like when the more capitalistic a country is, the more materialistic people are, the more functionalistic people are. But it's not that in collectivist cultures necessarily people are less materialistic or no. So it seems that the types of meanings are strongly related with the economic system and not necessarily with culture. And that was actually a finding that I was surprised by myself. And actually, so yeah, the more capitalistic a country is, the more people focus on materialistic and hedonistic types of meanings, and also more functionalistic people are. Whereas the less capitalistic country is, the more authentic, social and larger types of meanings people actually experience. And this is actually also in line with some other studies who used some other data, but it seems to be a similar trend, similar conclusions. And then I actually looked also at, well, we also have some data about the average mental health in countries. I thought, let's also look at that. When I'm doing all the statistical analysis, let's add that. Why not? So I actually found that actually capitalism or the economic system does not directly predict mental health. It's not like very immediate. However, it's indirect. So that means that in capitalist countries, people have a more materialistic, a more self-oriented type of perspective on life, more functionalistic, and that predicts a worse mental health. So, in other terms, capitalism seems to lead to worse mental health because it leads to individuals having a stronger focus on materialistic, hedonistic, and self-oriented types of meaning, and having a weaker focus on social and larger types of meaning. And these were quite strong mediation effects that I was quite surprised by when I found that. So what I did then was, I thought, great, I've now seen this in the literature, in the reviews, but let's then also have a look at interviews. Let's do some interviews. Well, I'm not going into those details, but what I did is I interviewed 8 people who self-identify themselves as capitalists, and 8 people who identify themselves as anti-capitalists. And I thought, well, let's look what type of patterns arrive from there. And I did some phenomenological analysis. I won't go into details, that will be a totally different lecture. And I asked questions like, what do you experience as your meaning in life? How do you know what's meaningful in your life and what is not meaningful? How do you feel that capitalism helps you to experience meaning in life, or how do you feel that capitalism hinders you to experience meaning in life? How does capitalism influence your moods? And do you feel that you'll be able to overcome the limitations of capitalism, and if so, how? And then I started to look at all those outcomes, and you can see how I've been, for each of those questions, I identify different themes. And when I started then to cluster them all again, this is actually where I found those 2 trends. And hey, that's the same table as you saw before. Yes, so it's very clear that also from the interviews where a lot of the same trends could be seen, where some people have like suffering from capitalist life syndrome, and others strongly experience like that they are oriented more towards a meaning-oriented economy. However, these are, so I've now looked at the history of economics. I've looked at interviews, but then I thought, let's do a survey to really validate this. You may have seen some links to this, and this is what I've done in the last half year. It's a worldwide survey of meaning in life. And I really want to look again at all the same questions. Is there such a thing as capitalism, midlife syndrome? And yeah, questions like that. And I also wanted to look at individual values. So not only looking at like, what does the country say, but also what are individual experiences. So until now, I've included 1,239 people from 49 countries. And these are some of the questionnaires. And this is my statistical model, because I used multi-level structural equation modeling, for those who know. But as you can see, capitalist life syndrome are those characteristics that I've mentioned before, those 6 aspects. And yes, those data again confirm, and again you'll be able to understand this immediately, I'm sure. But indeed the summary is that yes, those symptoms, what I call the symptoms, like having a materialistic focus and functionalistic, having capitalist values, they're all very strongly related. That's very much, again, confirmed. And interestingly enough, it's not only the country that's influential, but also the individual values. So it's more the individual and how they relate and what their values are that's actually a bit more influential than the system or the country in which they live. And again, I found that capitalism has a large impact on their mental health due to the individual materialistic, self-oriented types of meaning. Yeah, I'll skip this one. So this is how I started my presentation. Like, yeah, is there such? Yeah, I was saying, well, is there a relationship between individual meanings and the national or the ideas about our economy? Yes, they're very much related. Is there such a thing as the capitalist life syndrome? Yes, it seems from all those different studies that that's confirming that, yes, there's such a thing as a specific lifestyle that is connected with living in capitalist countries. However, that's not the only answer. We can also look at a more meaning-oriented economy. and we are in a period of transition. And I was going to say a bit more about those applications, but I'm always like speaking too much, so yeah, I also have too much slides, but I'll just rush through it. Because the big question is, okay, if we are in such a period of transition, like, why is it that so many people continue with this capitalist lifestyle when actually a lot of people, when they feel trapped, they feel those questions, struggling with making decisions, struggling with mental health. Why would people continue? Why? Martin already said something about that, and I think we all know. I don't need to explain the slide, I think. You understand how actually the capitalist life syndrome can only survive due to the continuous implicit and explicit manipulation of our meanings. And because products are often sold not only as a product, but it gives you like meaning in life. Like, we're not drinking Coke because it just gives a nice flavor for a couple of seconds, but because it also gives us a smile, of course. At Panasonic, it gives us ideas for life, of course. So, implicitly, that's what we're being told all the time when we live in this capitalist country, and that is very much how that influences. However, there's also an impact on our mental health, and that's also the book that we have just published, and we're going to speak a bit more about that in the break. And yeah, about Brexit and Trump. Well, I'm sure that it's like almost like a similar way how people have been captured as the Stockholm Syndrome or the capitalist life syndrome. But when we look at the transition, why is there such a transition? Why do people actually change from, how are people able to actually break out from that capitalist life syndrome, and why can people become more meaning-oriented? Actually, Karl Marx was already saying it himself. He said, well, capitalism will carry within it the seeds of its own destruction. And I was always quite skeptic about this, but then I started to look, yeah, it makes sense, because the thing is, actually our full existence is at stake. Because like yesterday we were speaking in one of the workshops also about Brexit, where we were saying, well, we are actually not sure about whether we will be able to, let's say, have food and medicines after the 31st of October, when there's a hard Brexit. We don't know. So quite literally, we feel trapped, and we are literally in an existential crisis. Our mental health is suffering. So that internal pressure on an individual level and on a social level is saying, if nothing changes, I will die physically, psychologically, or existentially. Therefore, I must change. And this is what I dare to say, is the more extreme capitalism becomes, the more extreme we get stuck in this capitalist life syndrome, the more an internal pressure builds up, that we feel there needs to be a change. And that's a change which in itself is not like merely materialistic, but goes beyond that. And I'm really going for a quick now, where I know. So, and when we look at like, how can we actually create a change? How can that happen? This is another thing that I've worked on a couple of years ago, and I've been more or less involved with Extinction Rebellion, where a lot of my stuff actually also, it's very much in the same line, where I was saying, well, effective social movements, they focus on non-materialistic and non-functionalistic types of meanings. So we already show what the alternative type of economy, the meaning-oriented type of economy, can be more about. And these are values that are actually explicitly behind this big climate campaign that's going on at this moment. Because individuals engage in political activism, people engage in this change because it's meaningful to them. And so, what I'm saying here at the end is like, we have different reasons to be involved in political activism, because, again, people, it's for materialistic reasons, for hedonistic, because it can be fun to be an activist, but also because people have a social focus, a larger focus. So, and we need also, as possibly also in our community, as political involved people, actually also have a look at that, at like, why are we involved in activism? And I think we should do much more research on this. And I think this will be one of my last slides where I'm actually saying, okay, what's this transition about? What do we need to do? So I think it's really important to show and make it visible and let people actually feel the tensions of this capitalist life syndrome. And actually, in that way, to create an individual transition and this demand for a systematic change. But we also need like a coherent vision of what would a meaning-oriented economy look like. At this moment, we don't have like one clear vision on that, I think. We also need to have like plurality of meanings. So not only like speaking about, let's have a big, for instance, not only speaking about basic income. It's great to have, if everyone would have the material means, but it's much more than that. It's not only money that matters. It involves all types of meaning. It involves a bigger meaning that we think about. Hope and realism at the same time. And actually also as counselors, as coaches, to not only see your clients as individuals, but as individuals always in the context, to address that from like a critical and a radical perspective. And this is very much like different ways how we can find meanings. We can still stick within the system, but try within our options to look and to, for instance, like Whole Foods or other kind of businesses which make some tiny changes. With that totally getting rid of the full system. But then actually we can also say, well, we do something radically different, meanings outside of capitalism. Or that we say, well, we're really going to fight against capitalism. Or we can actually start to think and have dreams about a system, an economy that's beyond capitalism. Well, as you can already hear, I can just continue, but I have got the feeling of totally hungry, so I'm going to leave it with here. And I think my main conclusion is very much like how our economy is already in our individual lifestyles. And I think, indeed, it's very much what you were already saying about the personal is political, and the political is personal. And we can already make a change as individuals. And I will be very much interested in hearing your ideas and have loads of conversations about this. So thank you very much for this.